Today we're going to talk about using design boards. In the past we've used pantographs to quilt out some of our designs. Actually the design on the design board are the same as what you can get on a pantograph in many cases, depending on the size of the design. The difference between a design board and a pantograph is that on a pantograph the laser light shines directly on a paper pattern and you follow that laser light dot tracing visually the design. On a pattern board, what you have are deep grooves and a 1/4 inch thick plexiglass or plastic board, and there's a stylus that fits into the grooves, and the stylus basically acts like training wheels, allowing you to trace exactly inside the groove of that design. Now if you push too hard you can knock the stylus out of the grooves, but if you're paying attention you can follow the design and get an almost perfect representation onto the quilt. In the same way that there's a distinct point between the laser light and the head of the machine, that same reference is true with the stylus and the head of the machine. They're exactly the same distance apart, so whatever you do on the back end will stitch out on the front end. In this particular case I have 3 boards set up, which is what I needed to do the width of the quilt I'm doing, but I do want to show you a little bit about the design boards themselves. On the design here you can see how the design follows across from one board to the next. There are 2 O-rings on each end of the board so that you can connect the boards together to keep them accurately in place. However, these boards are not reversible, so if they're not in the correct position they will not follow through. So you do have to pay attention when you're putting the boards together to make sure that the design follows. Also on the back you can see that there is some non-skid strips on the back of the board. That helps keep the design board in place, but you know it's not going to be absolutely permanent, so we do tape them down once we have them in position. You can see here that I have used some green painter's tape to to put on the edge of the board so that they don't move at all. I also have marked here on the edge where this leading edge of the border would be, so I know when to stop. Let's see if we can get a picture. I have the stylus set up so if I put it at the lowest point on the design, you can see here where the head of the machine is that it is at the top leading edge of the quilt. So I know that when I stitch this out it will stitch across perfectly at the top of the quilt and get me ready to do the next row. So I'm going to go ahead and get the thread started into the quilt and pull the threads up and move into my start position, and I'll show you what the first row looks like. Now I have my thread started in the machine, the needle's down, and I'm at my start position. So what I am going to do is lead into the beginning of the first groove and then set my stylus down. Now all I'm doing is delicately moving the machine so that the stylus will stay in the groove. Again, it would be possible for me to hit the machine hard enough that I could knock this back out of the groove, but there would be no reason for me to be sewing that hard or that fast. The nice thing about these pantograph boards is that you can get a perfect representation They do give you this sense of training wheels for people that have been afraid to start quilting on their long arm. This would be a perfect way to start, because as you are doing these designs over and over, you are building muscle memory and learning what it feels like to move the machine, to do a curve, and to get a really good design. Also, after you've invested in both the quilt and the machine, it gives you a finished product that is something that you can be proud of. And it's not just for beginners, because there are some designs that pantograph designers have made that are very hard to freehand, even if you have been doing pantographs for a long time. I find that anything geometric, perfect circles, straight lines, anything that is really geometric in nature is almost impossible to freehand. And you would be required to have a computerized system in order for you to be able to do those designs well. Even one small mistake in the middle of a whole quilt that wasn't done beautifully in a geometric design would stand out. Whereas an organic pantograph of leaves or feathers, if you're off a little bit, it just doesn't show. You can see how quickly this moves along. It's giving me great curves on the front of the quilt. Now I'm coming up to the point where I have finished off the quilt. So what I'm going to do is just sew ahead by lifting the stylus so I can go ahead and complete this design element. By lifting the stylus up just for that moment until I got it to the next groove, I was able to go ahead and finish out this design. And now I'm ready to go ahead and advance the quilt to the next position and do the next row. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. Okay, I've stitched out my first row, and I've gone ahead and trimmed my threads on the edge, and now it's time for me to roll up the quilt to get to the next row of stitching. And these design boards have little divots or dimples in the quilt board, and those divots are how you position the quilt so that you get perfect placement and equidistance between your rows. So you can do this one of two ways. You can either hover this just above where the divot is and do a visual representation as we're rolling the quilt until we get down to the lowest point below that divot. Or you could use a piece of tape that might even make it a little bit easier by covering up all of the design element grooves except for that dot. That way when this slides down, the only place it could go is into that spot. And you could do it either way. You could do it as a visual representation, or you could use the tape. What I'm going to do is drop the needle on the quilt. My needle now is locked into the quilt, so when I roll the quilt up, it will move. As you can see, the stylus is moving as I roll the quilt. The head of the machine is floating with it. It just clicked into place. So now I know that I am in the right position. So I can go ahead and lock the quilt back up and get ready for the next row of quilting. This time I wanted you to be able to see the front of the quilt as we're stitching this out, so you can see the smoothness of the stitching as it goes. It'll just give you a slightly different perspective of how this process works. You can see by repeating the design over and over in this manner how you would develop a good sense of muscle memory and get the feeling of how the machine works. And while you're learning, you're still getting some really beautiful stitching and design elements on your quilt. Many people that own a long arm machine only ever use pattern boards. They never progress to pantographs. They never do custom quilting. Maybe they have some tremors in their hand or something, and this is a good way to help steady their hand and create beautiful designs. I have been quilting for probably 30 years, and there are still some designs that I just won't do. As I mentioned earlier, geometric designs are just really hard to do and get them done beautifully so that the design element isn't messed up with, one little off row of stitching, a line that isn't perfectly straight, or a square corner. One of the items that we carry is also a series of circles or spirals that would be impossible to do freehand. But the concentric circles and the spirals on the board will give you an absolutely perfect rendition of circles on the quilt. And basically that's what we're all looking for, is that perfection of design on our finished piece. We don't want to spend a lot of time making a quilt and have it not turn out because we had a skill issue. The other thing that I have never been able to really get over is that these really go fairly quickly. I always imagined that an edge-to-edge design would be very time-consuming and that it would be faster to do custom work. But for me, I can't plan out ahead well enough and I get stuck. Here's the point where I have to pull up the stylus and move up to get to the next design spot. There we go. And there we're off. You can see by following the design board, I was able to get really beautiful design and stitch quality all the way across the quilt. And with following the divot, with the when you roll up the quilt, it's really easy to get the perfect spacing in between each of the two rows. There's a perfect example there. You can see just about an inch between the top of one design and the bottom of the other, which is just about perfectly what you want, so the quilt will be evenly quilted when it's finished. And I've already done 2 passes on this, and it's probably about a third of the way finished. So I'll just go ahead and finish quilting this out, and I'll post a photo of the finished quilt when it's done. And if you haven't tried the design board, or if you have any questions, please let us know. They're available on our website.